This first geometry video is going to cover a lot of vocabulary. So in your note packet, you want to follow along and fill in anything that I have written down that you might have missing. And then you'll also notice I'll be making some side notes over here that you will want to fill in with your notes as well. So make sure you're listening carefully, following along visually, and writing things down. So in geometry, we have these things called points. Now you already know about points, I know that, but some things you need to know, or really just one thing you need to know, is that when we label points, we always have to use a capital letter. So if you notice, we've got 4 points over here. Here's point A, point B, point C, and point D. Those all have capital letters. If you ever use a capital letter in geometry, you are referring to a point. All right, lines. Lines are made up of points and are straight. So it takes at least 2 points to form a line. You have arrows on the end that show that the lines extend infinitely far in both directions. You'll notice our first line here, it has a lowercase letter. So some lines can be labeled with lowercase letters. So this we would call line, well, it's kind of sloppy, line M, lowercase letter. That's one way to identify a line or to label a line. The line to the right, you notice we have 3 points A, B, C, and notice how they're all capital letters, and we have a line going through, arrows on the end. So what could we call this line over here? Well, if you have points, you can just pick 2 points. Let's say we pick points A, B, and then we put a little line with arrows above it. That's line AB. We also could call it line BA, same exact line, and you can use any 2 points on the line. So you could also say this is line BC, as long as we're labeling it with that line above it using capital letters. We could say C and then B. So all of these labels work for that line that's drawn. Is there anything else we can use? Yep, we could say AC, so line AC, or line CA. So if you have points on a line, you can use those points to identify the line. And as you can see, the order doesn't matter that you write it. All of these 6 examples here refer to the same line. All right, so those are lines. We also have line segments. So a line segment are similar to lines. They're made up of points and they are straight, but segments have a definite beginning and end. They have endpoints. They are named in terms of their endpoints. So over here you can see we have the line segment between R and S. There's no arrows on the end. That's what makes this a segment versus a line. And we can label that RS, and we're going to put a line segment above with no arrow. Or we could change the order. We could say SR. So that's referring to the same line segment. This example on the right, we have 2 line segments formed together, giving us kind of a right angle, or it looks kind of like a right angle. The vertical one is this XY right here. So what would we call that? We could call it XY, capital letters, because we're using those points with a line segment above, or we could say YX. All right, now the horizontal line connects the Y and Z. Those are the endpoints. So YZ with a segment over it, or ZY. All right, so I want you to look at your notes and look at the video and see if we have all the same stuff written down, because you want to make sure that you're getting all of the details. You want to have nice, neat notes that you can look back at and use as a great reference for studying, and just to make sure that you master all of this wonderful geometry. And we'll go on to the next slide. All right, so in the last slide we learned about points, lines, and line segments. We have 2 other things to make sure that we understand. We've got these things called rays. Now, a ray begins at an endpoint and then it extends infinitely far in one direction. So it kind of looks like maybe half of a line. It's not half of a line, that's not the right word to use, but you can see in the pictures to the right, you've got an endpoint and then it extends away and you've got the arrow on the other side. When you are labeling these, you must name the endpoint first so you know where the ray begins. So on all of these, the order does matter how we label these. So for this first example, the endpoint is A, and again, capital letters because those are referring to points. So we have A and then B, and then that is what goes above it. It looks just like the ray. Not arrows on both sides. So it looks like a line segment with an arrow on one side. Now the next one, which one do we start with? Well, we have to say, starting with the endpoint, which is C. So we're going to say C, and you actually have two options here. You could say CD, because it does pass through point D, and then put your ray above it. Or you could say CE, because our ray does go through both points C and E, starting with our endpoint C. All right, next one, not to be a little bit tricky, but it's kind of facing a different way. So how do you label a ray? Start with the endpoint, which is X, and then the other point, Y, goes after. So would you be marked off if you didn't have these labeled with this amount of detail? Yes, you would. Unfortunately, we get really picky about it. So be nice and neat. I would say this right here, look at this guy. This is getting maybe a little bit less neat. You want to make sure that when I'm looking at your work, I don't say, well, that kind of looks like an arrow, and I think that you're calling this ray a line. So just be as neat as you can. Just don't rush through writing the stuff down and you'll be okay. All right, and the last thing to talk about are angles. An angle is made up of two rays that have the same endpoint. So over here you can see we've got these two rays and they're sharing this endpoint right there. So angles are made up of those two rays we also call sides. Those are the sides of the angle. And that endpoint that they share right there, that's called a vertex. So you've got two sides and a vertex. Now we've got a few different ways for how to label our angles. This first example, you want to look at the information they gave you. Well, all they told us was this angle in here is angle 3. So our label, we get a little, it kind of looks like an angle, kind of looks like a weird L maybe. So angle 3. So that's how we label angle 3. Our next one has a little bit more information because we do have 3 points. That would be the best way to name an angle if you can. So if you have that much information, let's use all that information. The only thing when you're using 3 points is the vertex has to be the middle point in your label. So we have angle, we could say B, A, C. Kind of goes in order around the angle. Now, as long as your vertex is in the middle, you could switch up the B and the C, and you could say angle C, A, B. That's another way to label it. Technically, you also could say, because there are no other angles at that vertex, you could call this angle A. But again, to be more specific, using all 3 points is helpful. Kind of like the next example, you can see we've got this angle and we know the vertex is D. We don't have 2 more points to help us out with our labeling, so we'll just call that one angle D. That's how we would label it. Now, this last one, you can see we have 2 angles. Well, really, we actually have 3 angles. You have these 2 small ones, and then you also have this big one. So if you were to say, oh, it's just angle S, we'd get a little bit confused because we'd say, well, is that the big one, or maybe this medium-sized one, or the smaller one? So we need to be more specific. That would not be a good label for this angle. So how could we label it? And let's just talk about how could we label the big angle. So we'll look at how would we label this guy right here. And we could call it angle. Now which one has to go in the middle? The R, the S, or the V? Remember, your vertex is always the middle one. So R, S, V, or we could call it angle V, S, R. And now anyone looking at this would know that we mean this big angle, not one of those 2 little ones. And that's how you label angles.